It is August the 1st, the very first day, 2024. I'm going to be your host tonight. I'm Dana. You can call in at these live shows at 709-589-4406. I can't believe we made it to the end of the week. It was worth it. I feel much better doing it. Hope everybody had a great day today. We're going to do a news cycle. Talk about Fukushima, nuclear meltdowns. Fukushima contaminated soil. They had 105,000 sites where they're storing 1-ton bags. They got around 30 million 1-ton bags. What you're looking at is a farmer in a nuclear wasteland, abandoned, except for farming. That makes a lot of sense. And they're harvesting food, rice in particular, the golden rice bran, and they're right alongside of 1-ton bags of radiation fallout that was picked up. Officially, 2016 was 30 million 1-ton bags. They never stopped picking up at that point either. Again, these are pictures from the media chastising anybody criticizing the farmers, calling it harmful rumors. So 30 million 1-ton bags. Some say 60
There's about
million.
60 million tons of contaminated soil that's being stored, planned to be stored, outside the Fukushima Daiichi perimeter fence. So
science outweighs irrational reasoning. And this was as Japan is ready down a lease to treat a radioactive water, blah, blah, blah. There's room for... Now, this is a professor of nuclear and quantum engineering in South Korea. He said the 1.37 million tons of water that was in the tanks had approximately 2.2 grams of tritium. And they were going to release 0.06 grams every year for 30 years or something. Nothing got out, despite the food being banned in 55 countries and 14 prefectures. So he said nothing got out there, and whatever they collected was filtered, and the only thing left over in the 1,000 tanks was 2.2 grams of tritium. This is two of the reactors, reactor 4 and reactor 3. The discharge like throwing a sugar cube of 3 grams into the ocean. Okay, so he's saying this is a nuclear quantum engineering professor in South Korea. It's 2.2 grams. And everything was in the tanks and everything is filtered and ignore this, pretend that's not real, pretend that's not real. It's equal to 3 grams of sugar. How can you say... This is a professor of quantum engineering. And he's saying that is equal to 3 grams of sugar going into the ocean. That's not true.
The Fukushima plant sits smack in the middle of an underground aquifer. Deep beneath the ground, the site is rapidly being overwhelmed by water. Beneath the surface, water flows downhill and into the basement of the damaged reactor buildings. There it is contaminated with high levels of radiation. To stop the groundwater flowing on into the nearby ocean, engineers are building an underground barrier. But that is causing the groundwater level to rapidly rise. It's now so high the water will soon reach the surface. Then it will start flowing overground into the sea. This week, the company that owns Fukushima, TEPCO, made this disturbing admission.
We understand that this water discharge is beyond our control, and we do not think the current situation is good.
Outside experts say it's now clear TEPCO is incapable of handling the cleanup at Fukushima. It's time for the Japanese government to step in. The situation is already beyond what TEPCO can handle, he says. If it were possible to take proper measures, they would have done it already. It's not as if TEPCO is refusing to do what they can. They're doing everything they can, but there are no perfect solutions. Even if the government does step in, it's not clear what it can do. The only other solution is to pump out the contaminated groundwater and put it in storage tanks. But after just 2 years, the site is already jammed with more than 1,000 giant tanks. Most of them are already full up. At least 400 tons of new water pours into the site every day, and it's going to continue for years and years. Fukushima's water crisis has only just begun. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News in Tokyo.
So you got 1,000 tanks in 2013. They were almost all full. That was Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. So they ran out of options. TEPCO was saying the government should take over because they don't know what they're doing. And they should never have been left in charge because they're an operator. They didn't create reactors. They don't make reactors. They don't make fuel assemblies or fuel rods or anything like that. It was like putting your veterinarian and taking them out of the veterinarian and bringing them to a garage, making them fix cars. It's just like, what? Doesn't work, right? And then the report was the BBC. That was 2013. That was Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. What he's showing you is reactor 4. So about 6 months later, here's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. Now he's pretending that he's at the top of the building to your left. In 2014.
So this is really why we've been brought here. Where I'm standing is on top of what used to be reactor building number 4. The whole of this building was blown apart by a huge explosion after the tsunami disaster. But down inside this pool behind me here is still a vast amount of nuclear fuel. You can see it down there beneath the water. More than 1,300 fuel rods. Those have got to come out. They're currently 30 meters above ground level. This whole building is still not entirely stable, so they've got to get those out.
So now he's saying on top of a building to your left that doesn't even exist. And that was 2014. In 2020, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is claiming he's in reactor 3.
This is very strange to be standing inside here because this huge structure I'm standing inside is right on top of reactor building number 3.
Well, you can't be on top of it because the fuel pools, the reactor cores were ejected out of the buildings. They don't even exist.
And down underneath me here is the melted reactor core inside this building.
Now, he's talking about the fuel pool. I'm going to play that clip for you in a second. So he's claiming the next clip you're going to see is these reactors all get the same design. He's going to do the same thing where he's claiming he's above the fuel pools. There's 2 fuel pools, and this is the reactor core. It's also at the top of the building. He's going to claim he's looking down into the fuel pool. Now, the buildings were 190 feet, 65 meters, 19-story buildings.
Over the top here, they have built a shield to lower the radiation levels so that we can come up here, so that workers can come up here to construct this. But radiation levels are still very high here.
And because of that, we can only spend a few minutes here. Now, if you come over here, there's my alarm going off. This is the spent fuel pool. Down inside here, more than 560 spent fuel assemblies.
So he's saying that's the spent fuel pool. So for that to be the spent fuel pool, Rupert Winfield Hayes has to be above those red depictions up there. That's the fuel pool at the very top of the building, but the building doesn't even exist. That's Reactor 3 at Fukushima. So you got him saying all the tanks were full.
But after just 2 years, the site is already jammed with more than 1,000 giant tanks. Most of them are already full up.
Okay, so most of them were full up. A few months later, in the beginning of 2014, Rupert Winfield Hayes claims he's in the fuel pool at the top of a building that doesn't exist. Then he does the same thing in 2020, 6 years later, where he claims he's at the top of that building. That building actually doesn't exist. He said he built this contraption over it. Nobody can go in there. The buildings are long gone. Underneath it looks like that, right? Okay. So all the tanks were full in 2013. 2013. February 11, 2013, this is images that were released, and you see the image below it. That's the ELPS decontamination system under the construction. We'll move ahead to August 9, 2014. The other story was February 11th, 2013. Go ahead a year and a half to August 9, 2014, or March, April, May, June, July, August. Yeah, a year and a half later. The disaster site has struggled with the water decontamination for years and just announced recently that they think they finally have the ELPS system operational. That's 2013. So the tanks were all. So this didn't come to fruition, what they're saying, until early 2015. But the tanks were all filled almost in 2013 in just the first 2 years. So there was nothing. I apologize, everybody's heard this stuff a lot. Nobody's heard it more than my 2 ears. It's a nightmare. But the information I'm showing you and providing for you is enough to convict or beat these people in court. You can beat these people in court with the documentation. Okay, so let's stay on the same theme for a few minutes here. August the 20th, 2013, Mary Yamaguchi, I guess she's a CIA asset or something, because we know they run AP and Reuters, right? The intelligence agencies. It's 100% confirmed. August the 20th, 2013, they had 1,000 steel tanks. So there's more evidence that Rupert Winfield Hayes was talking about. March the 10th, 2014, Mary Yamaguchi again. Now they got 1,200 tanks. In 2017, they had 900 tanks. Imagine trying to walk with both of your feet flat on the ground. You ever do that? I'm assuming that's green screen. They overlaid it there for some reason. I don't know why they done it, but they got lots of homeless people. This is why we got a poll tonight, by the way. I asked the question was, after 13 years, should nuclear scientists work at Fukushima's meltdowns so the homeless can have a day off? Does Do the homeless and the destitute and the victims of society and the immigrants don't speak the language deserve a day off? And so this obviously is not a nuclear scientist, nuclear academic, a nuclear professional, right? This is clearly somebody don't know nothing about anything. And it's the strangest picture because you got both feet flat on the ground, but his arm and his body posture is portraying that he's about to take, that he's walking, right? Clearly, whatever, right? That was in the newspaper, though. That came with that story that I just showed you. Let's move ahead to 2019. Japan will have to dump the radioactive water into the Pacific. More than 1 million tons of contaminated water. This is 2019. The tanks were all full. Allegedly, they never stopped putting stuff in tanks, right? Now, the official numbers for going in the tanks was 130 tons a day. This was water they were pouring on 4 reactors, and then they were siphoning it out through wells or something, and then that was being put in a tank. And, well, actually what they said, it was being filtered. It goes through the ELP system, it gets filtered, and then it goes into the tanks. And where it's stored. And they stored it, the official stories, they stored it till August 24th of last year. But on July the 13th is when they came out and said it was like 2.2 grams of tritium. That's when they officially moved the goalpost. So they have 1,000 tanks on this line right here in 2019. 2021, they had 1,000 tanks. So they had 1,000 tanks 2013 and 1,000 tanks in 2021. They got 1,000 tanks today too, right? Mary Yamaguchi 2023. Accumulated in 1,000 tanks. So here's Mary Yamaguchi last year, the same one that I showed you from 2013, from the same media, saying 1,000 tanks. We got BBC saying the tanks were almost all full in 2013, but then pretending he was in reactor 4 and reactor 3 to follow in the next early 2014, and pretending he was in reactor 3 in 2020. This is the water filtration system as it prepares to release it, and in Futaba town, which is abandoned, stored in 1,000 tanks. In 2014, they got 1,000 tanks, right? Okay, we're almost through this. My apologies to everybody. Okay, so let's just talk about the water filtration, the ice wall, a few other mitigation and stories that they came out with. Let's start off with this one. April 21st, 2014. So in August 2014, the ELP system still wasn't operational, right? I already showed you that. Here's another story about that, though. The Advanced Liquid Processing Systems, ELPS, is yet to function reliably. Well, yet to function at all. TEPCO, and it can't work anyway, because you're taking water that you're pouring over a reactor core and putting it through a filter. So now it's thousands of sieverts, and 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. So how do you change the filter? How do you get back in the building? Like the amount of mitigating efforts that has to go into something like that would be like dozens of documentaries. But we don't have any evidence. They're claiming that there's no toxicity to the filters, which is, come on, right? So August the 12th, 2014, the Areva system, which was the same as the French system, which is the same as the Toshiba system, the ELP system. For the last 3 years, the ELP system, which is France, or the Areva system, blah, 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 blah. and I apologize again, to abandon the Riva system amid contaminated water crisis. That didn't work in 2013. The ALP system didn't work in 2014, and we know it doesn't work anyway. They admit that there's parts on the site you don't have full control. In other words, lethal doses. The homeless don't have control, right? Because nuclear scientists won't go there. So July 29, 2014, TEPCO says the groundwater bypass operation is not having an effect at Fukushima Daiichi. TEPCO officials have admitted that groundwater bypass operations are failing to reduce tons of water from entering the crippled reactor buildings at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. TEPCO officials, now I played a video in 2013, the video of TEPCO, the guy in charge at the plant, saying, we need the government to take over, we're overwhelmed. I played that video at the beginning, right? In 2014, he still admitted the groundwater bypass operation, and so what they were doing behind, because the plant is on a mountain behind it, right? The water runs down the mountain naturally, and runs through the site. And they talked about that, right? There's a big aquifer under this site, and I have people go into the comments section and vehemently deny there was an aquifer underneath the site, but I do provide evidence for all of my assertions. I always have. And if I provide it all the time, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes I might say that without showing the evidence. And I know that's wrong. And that's why the shows are 2 hours long, is because I'm forced to be so methodical. And everybody shits on me as if I'm a bad person. And I'm fighting for everybody. I'm fighting for every species. I'm fighting for you, your friends, your families, your loved ones, whether you care or not, whether you understand it or not, because there's nobody else out there doing it. I'm doing it through an educational program so we can have a conversation about it. If that makes me a bad person, I guess I'm a bad person. I don't see it that way, and so, a couple of weeks ago I hurt myself. I hurt my lungs is what I hurt. And it scared me, and I couldn't breathe, and it took a long time. It was like 9 days before I started doing shows again, and it's still very hard on me. And I don't want to jeopardize what I'm doing here. So I'm gone into safe mode where I don't do nothing. I don't push myself. I don't stress myself. I'm not doing anything that's going to make me breathe hard until I feel that I'm able to do it. And I don't feel that might not ever come back. This is how I feel about it. But I'm doing pretty good, I think, over the last 2 weeks. Now I'm starting to get confidence again. But I'm not cocky and I'm not stupid. I'm not going to be taking any chances. I could be down for quite a while, and I can still hopefully do what I'm doing now, at least that much. I want to be out researching, and we went through an enormous amount of effort so that we can get ready to do it. And now I got injured, and there's nothing I can do about it. I wasn't healthy to begin with when I started all this, was I? So the bypass operations failed to reduce the water coming down the mountain. So the next mitigation, they were going to put a fence, and the fence was going to cost $1 billion. But you can't build a fence to stop radiation. It simply doesn't work that way. And another version of a fence was a ice wall. Excuse me. And they found the ice wall plans are not progressing according to plan. We have to form the ice stopper because we can't make the temperature. It's never been tried before on that kind of a scale, right? And why would you build an ice wall when you can build a real wall? Because it was experimental, so taxpayers had to pay for it, apparently. They've rolled out every scam to cover it up, and they've done nothing to try to deal with it. That's simply the reality of the story. And because this is such a devastating, this is not an accident, it's an event. This is equivalent to getting hit with a meteorite. But the effects are so slow, but permanent, that it's very difficult to perceive it. And so the cover story was climate change. The side effects from this. Now, there was also the series system and the Current system for water filtration, right? And those systems quietly disappeared. And so the problem is, like, there's the series system, the Current system for water filtration, allegedly was going to filter out cesium, just cesium, 137 in particular, because that's their cover story for 80 years. It's a real isotope. It's real nasty too, and it's definitely a problem. But there's 1,000 other isotopes you're supposed to worry about. And so they just completely keep you focused on cesium-137 for the most part. So the atoms from water, the atoms from a rock, the atoms from a tree, the atoms from wood that you burn in a fire, the smoke, the particulates, or I'm sure the atoms, not particulates, but the atoms of any object are the exact same. And there's different weights, but they don't matter because you can put 200 million of them on the head of a needle, but you can't see it with your naked eye, for instance. So a single atom out of 200 million atoms is basically, not basically, but is invisible, right? But they're all cesium-137 or uranium-235 or americium-241 or neptunium-242 or strontium-90 or iodine-131 or whatever. All of them are the exact same size. All of them are pulsing energy almost at the speed of light every second. And all of them have the same attributes when it comes to anthropogenic man-made radiation. They're all exactly the same when you get down to the scale of filters. Now, if the Current system and the series system, and they're running multiple sieverts, if they're running multiple sieverts through this every moment, you can't get back in the building because unless the filtration is 10-foot thick lead all around, you're talking about thousands of sieverts an hour. Because you're pouring water over melted reactor cores, and it's picking up particulates. So you can filter that out, some of it, but you don't want to, because the equipment is going to be too radioactive to get close to, and they acknowledge that with the AREVA system, because they did try to use it, and they didn't know how to decommission it once they started trying to use it because it was so radioactive that only the homeless were sent in, basically. And they just couldn't, it couldn't be done. And why would you even try? Because you're not a nuclear expert, you're in engineering, see? And so you were lulled into this complacency of building something which was meant to rob me and you of our health and of our future, and the species of their health and their future, and of the future of their future. Sounds a little something, but it's true. The plant is already releasing enormous amounts of highly contaminated water directly into the ocean from a plethora of leaks from the reactor buildings. So the reactor buildings are leaking. Let's look at them. Does that look like it's leaking? Could it leak out of that building? Am I being a drama queen by saying that's leaking? Are these buildings capable of leaking? How about if it rains on this building, how much do you think can actually get out? What kind of a leak? So if they have a typhoon, they do every year, multiple typhoons wash these buildings, just a wash. How much leaks out of the building? Or is leaking a poor choice of words? People did try to warn you. EU Energy Commissioner called Fukushima an apocalypse and that almost everything is out of control. Well, not almost, everything was out of control. All the infrastructure was ripped out for 1,200 miles. I think that qualifies rather, as out of control. France says Japan has lost control and the French should leave the country, not just Okuma Futaba or Fukushima Prefecture or the northern part of Japan, but leave the country. And when France tells you something like that after a nuclear accident, it's pretty wise to pay heed. Swiss embassy evacuated Tokyo fearing radiation. They're famous, right? For their radiation after Chernobyl. Tokyo has lost almost all control of the events at Fukushima, energy officials. Nuclear report warns of an apocalyptic scenario at Fukushima in the weeks ahead, and the ambassador said this could one day be considered the start of the ultimate catastrophe in the world. This could one day be considered the start of the ultimate catastrophe in the world. And there's many reasons to invoke that response. One of them is Japan is a prolific producer of food, and 55 countries banned the food from those 14 prefectures, which is half the country because they're big prefectures, for a decade. But then those people got replaced, and they slowly started removing the restrictions. This was the Chinese media came out with that depiction of Prime Minister Suga just puking radiation into the ocean, which is an actual very close. It's a very appropriate picture, like this one here. This man will sniff your bicycle seats. That's Rafael Grossi. He's the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of the UN. And Dwight Eisenhower warned us about UN, which was the first thing they done was went to war against North Korea, right? And millions dead, millions missing, millions in refugee camps, millions unaccounted for, millions of orphans. And all wars have been that exact way. This is Patrick Clausen.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States...
It's very hard to see how he's going to get to war with Iran.
President can get us to war with Iran. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
So this is how they get to war, right? And I put those pictures in because what he's suggesting is all of these wars, that they started the war and blamed it on the people they wanted to go to war with. Doomsday-like radiation, if the pool at Unit 4 caught fire, would be a global catastrophe. Well, there's the pools, and that's reactor 4, so it's 100% global catastrophe. German media
Maybe
came
worse
out
than
with this
thought.
depiction.
Studies from last year indicate that
Dispersal
radioactive
into
water will
directly into the
contaminate
ocean.
the entire Pacific Ocean in just 6 years. Kim Min-ji reports.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.
And so that was 6 years depiction, right? This is the airborne, and this is based on less than 30 days. And this particular model, I think, is, it's 16 days or something. This is the French government. We have studies of 1 million atoms per square meter of xenon-133. We have a Canadian study of 20 million particles, not atoms, but even worse, particles of radioactive iodine-131 per liter on the US. We have the West Coast hit with 220 million atoms per liter of iodine-129 after Fukushima. 220 million atoms on the West Coast. And it will look like this one. This was the cesium-137. And cesium-137 pulses energy 600 feet every second. And so the model you're looking at is equivalent of a snowstorm. So think of, you see the plume coming up, but think of that as a snowstorm coming out of Japan. Or not coming out of Japan, but starts in Japan. And so after 2 weeks, or 16 days after counting the tsunami, almost the whole planet is in a continuous snowstorm. Now think that the snow never melts and the snow never goes away. Now convert that over to man-made radiation, and because you can't see it, because it's not a snowstorm that you can see, but that's what happened. And so when you look at the studies, these are just a couple showing the numbers. So these are that one there, the 129 iodine, 220 million atoms per liter, and 20 million particles per liter. This was Vancouver, British Columbia, and this was actually in Ottawa, Canada. These were all sustained. Well, that's more than enough. We've never seen nothing like that in history, and that's more than enough to saturate the thyroid glands of all the species. But it's got a few other problems too that goes with this, because when it's in your body starts producing, or insects or birds or mammals or animals start producing white blood cells to counter the damage. So the radiation that you can't perceive because you can't smell it or see it or feel it or touch it or taste it or hear it or pick it up or anything, it's not like snowstorm, right, where you can physically see it, touch it. But anyway, it gets in your body and it sequesters there, it stays there, it binds to your organs, your muscles, and in your skeleton. And when we're talking about the iodine numbers, we know that the ratio is going to be 10 times more 132 for every iodine 131. And we know that there's going to be 30 times more iodine 133 for every iodine 131 produced. That's going to be in the same plume, obviously. And we know that there's 31 times more iodine 129 for every iodine 131 produced. And we also know that there's a ratio in the xenon-133, but we also have studies to back it up. And that the iodine-131 is unbelievably effective at ionizing and radiating the thyroid glands of all the species. Everything. Including humans, of course. And so is the iodine. And these numbers are... 185, not 185 million or 185,000 or 1,850 or whatever. It's 185 was considered in no-go zone at a nuclear site on your Geiger counter. Now, your Geiger counter is not going to register 220 million atoms. So people say, well, Dan, I got a Geiger counter, but it's not showing these numbers. Well, because it's not going to pick that up. Okay. And so the thyroid glands are saturated, but it's not just going to be the gammas, right? You also got to think about xenon-133. This is a bone seeker, for instance. Now, these are not the only studies, right? And by the way, this one is 1 million to 10 million atoms per cubic meter of air of cesium-137. I got a lot of these different studies, actual academic studies showing the following. The numbers, that's what I'm showing you. So this pulses energy every second for 600 feet, just this one plume. And there's no such thing as a plume of just cesium-137, right? But they can find it. There's no such thing as a plume of xenon-133, but they can find it, see? There's no such thing as a plume, just nothing but, in the plume of iodine-129. It's going to be loaded with all the other isotopes, is what I mean by when I was saying that. And it's the same thing for the iodine-129. And so what happens is the thyroid glands, but also the skeleton of all the species, and children and people, and your loved ones and friends and families and the elderlies, are bioaccumulating because there's so much of it. And that the xenon or the iodine-132 and 133s, which we know the ratios are much higher than the 131. So iodine-133 would have been the same ratio almost as the 129, right? Because it's 30 to 1 of the iodine-131. But the 132, there's 10 times more. 133, there's 30 times more than iodine-131. And that ionizes and radiates, the 132 and 133 ionizes and radiates the thyroid glands 9 times more effective than the 131 does, which is unbelievably effective on its own. Okay. And so the sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs fallout is documented from multiple institutions, for instance. The xenon is documented at 450,000 times above background level, but it's also documented at 1 million atoms per square meter. And then the 129 at 220 million atoms per liter. Every liter, no matter which one we're talking about, isotopes, is going to be saturated with all the other isotopes too. But because they can find that, then they can quantify through mathematical equations, extrapolate the other isotopes. And so what happened was the insects, not just humans, right? But everything, the insects, the birds, of course, because they're eating insects and bioaccumulating, and even worse. Small animals, the mammals, all the species are getting incredible doses all day long. They're getting full body X-rays. We're all getting that, of course, but the more vulnerable species, it's manifesting as an extinction event. And so gammas and alphas and neutrons and betas and everything, they don't mingle with each other. So when they're pulsing, all of them pulses energy. The iodine-131 is pulsing almost at the speed of light. The 129 is pulsing energy almost at the speed of light. The xenon-133 is pulsing energy almost at the speed of light. The cesium-137 is pulsing energy almost at the speed of light. And so you get this invisible snowstorm of these atoms, and we can't perceive it. The Geiger counter can, but we can't. And what it means, though, is, like, think of all of this as the radio, that's the cesium, that's uranium, that's the plutonium, that's the americium, that's the neptunium, that's the strontium. And when they're pulsing energies, they hit each other, they're changing direction. And they're doing it almost at the speed of light. If you have two objects, two pulses of energy, for instance, if it was just two of them, they're both pulsing almost at the speed of light. But it's worse than that, isn't it? You got ricochet everywhere. And so that's known as full-body X-rays, continuous full-body X-rays. And because there was so much of it, which is documented, numbers we've never heard tell of before, there's so much of it. That's another problem, right? Because you got gammas, alphas, neutrons, and betas, and then you got the X-rays. And that this stuff is 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison on top of that. So it's very nasty. So your body reacts, and the insects and birds and mammals and animals, bodies react by attacking it every second. And what I mean by that is, so say you drink a liter, you got 220 million atoms of iodine-129 in your body. But in that same liter, there's going to be 20 million atoms of iodine-131. In that same liter, it's going to be maybe 1 million atoms of cesium-137. And because this is the way that it works, if you just got a single one in your body, 50 years down the road, your body attacked it for 50 years with white blood cells. And then eventually build a tumor around it. And in order to have white blood cells, you got to displace the red blood cell. And the red blood cell is carrying oxygen nutrition. Oxygen and nutrition. And nutrition and oxygen, let's do it that way for 1 second. So one of the things we talked about was we expected to see an uptick in road rage, in air rage, in divorces and stuff like this, in people's fuses. We expect to see that get much shorter because they have less oxygen. Say people that have less oxygen, all of a sudden they're bioaccumulating that because they won't avoid eating rice from Japan. They're getting much more. But if you're eating rice, a lot of rice from Japan, for instance, and other stuff, peaches or whatever, that's a good way to get leukemia next week or the week after. Go and buy a big bag of Japanese rice. And when I was doing the research expeditions from Vancouver, British Columbia to Alaska for 6 years, I was isolated. There's 27,000 islands, and I would go into these little communities, and one of the first questions I would always ask is there a lot of strange cancers? There's a lot of people dying really young. There's a lot of people dying really quick. Now, I got a response that I wasn't expecting, and so I said, well, I'm leading the study, so I got to reframe it when I get into these communities and not lead them, right? And see if I can get them to tell me what's going on, see if I get the same response. And it was shocking that every community was overwhelmed with young people just dropping dead. They already got 2 weeks to go to the doctor and up the coastline to get on the ferry and go up to the doctor because they're really sick, and doctor tell them they got 2 weeks to live and there's nothing they can do for them. There's endless stories of that going on. Because a lot of the people on the coastline are eating a lot of filter feeders like oysters and scallops and abalones and stuff like this. And the filter feeders, shellfish, will bioaccumulate the radiation. I think it's 125,000 times more than a fish, for instance. And so it's like, the only way to describe it a lot of times is seafood could be, because it might not manifest for a year or two for you, but it could easily be a leukemia, a meal that gives you leukemia. And then over the many, many years of going along the coastlines, I have no illusions about what was going on, right? Everything is wiped out. There's nothing left. There's nothing left. Let me explain that to you. This is a radioactive fallout of, is this krypton? I can't remember. Or xenon-133. So this is based on 19.5 days, 468 hours. 19.5 days. And 19 is not very long, right? Now, the reason I got Fukushima radioactive fallout as global warming is to remind me to tell you that the supercell hurricanes, the supercell typhoons, the supercell cyclones, the derricos, random windstorms, the global warming, the ocean heating, etc., you can trace this back all the way to the beginning, the inception of the nuclear industry. Within 1 year, you start noticing some peculiar things, right, for die-offs and that. And, you know, it's easy you can find lots of things to blame it on, but ultimately, if you're honest and you start looking at the whole picture, and you get up to Fukushima, you see Fukushima was such a pulse event, and the numbers I just showed you quantifies those assertions, right? It was the biggest pulse event we've ever had, and that was the tipping point. And so, because it covered the whole planet in 19.5 days, it attacks the water, which is 70% of the planet. But water at the surface is where the phytoplankton exists, right? And the phytoplankton is the basis of your food chain, the basis of your carbon sequestering chain, and the basis of your oxygen chain. And so when you attack, because both freshwater and saltwater have the phytoplankton is the very beginning of the food chain. And the eggs and larvae from squid and starfish and sea urchins and snails, mollusks and everything else, at their very inception, when they're still in so-called sperm mode, because like starfish and sea urchins will just release their sperm into a cloud into the ocean, and you got all the males and females doing it, of mussels and everything else, right? And so very bad visibility when I used to work in those conditions, and in the summertime, because of all the, and we would call it a soup of life. So a typical drinking glass would have 1 billion creatures into it in the ocean. Pretty incredible, right? And so I would describe it as a soup of life, because growing up, that's what we used to get our soup out of the big pot, was a cup, and then you would put that into your bowl, and that was known as, you would call it, that's why I call it the soup of life, but it is, that is what it was, right? It was 1 billion creatures, and 75 million to 100 million of that billion creatures in a cup of salt water was phytoplankton. So it's a very important. And then a lot of the whales, the big whales, and so we knew right away that there was a good possibility we were going to start seeing emaciated whales, particularly the filter feeders, the large ones. And then we would expect to see the same thing in a lot of the microscopic eating birds, like the storm petros or the ctenioclids and stuff like this. And this is what we're seeing, right? We're seeing a total decimation, and they're showing up everywhere, starved to death. So I launched research expeditions to see if I can see the difference. And the articles are meant to give you an idea, but you're talking about Vancouver, British Columbia to the coast of Alaska, year after year. And the species are well known. That's the species. They're very well known. The species, and up here is the coastline of British Columbia. So the species to your left were missing from the coastline. And the diversity was pretty incredible. not incredible, it was amazing. And it was the most endearing facet of the job was you got to experience this every day, all day long, to work in this environment till you left. Pretty amazing, right? To see that every day. Because that's what I'm used to. And that's normal. But after Fukushima, we have the headlines to back up this event, by the way. The species disappeared. To your right. So now I'm not doing good as it is, but I got to do another year or 2 years of trips to see if the species come back. So I said, because otherwise it's not you can't quantify the study, and it's insane that I had to do something like that. But we felt, because the world was still sleepwalking on the top of a mountain, we were had this fantasy that if I worked really, really hard, we could eventually have a conversation about this and we can find a way forward. We can't fix what happened, but we have a lot of documentation. This was a study of the Neptunium-239 dispersal, and you can see the plume to your top left is based on 20 days after the tsunami. 15 days after the last reactor detonated for the first time, because some of them detonated the next week too, right? So I've done the whole coastline year after year after year after year, looking for the species that I'm used to diving with every day and I'm familiar with. Officially, this has never happened, but it actually did happen. This is a study from Norwegian Institute of Air Research, by the way. And the species to your left, we know there's 7,000 plus, highly visible species. In the tidal zones was 700 algae. And in those 700 algae was 5,000 invertebrates without the backbones, like little shrimp, that were named, that were studied, that were acknowledged by the academic communities who perused these coastlines. So there was 70 different species of sponges. They all came in multiple vibrant colors. There was all kinds of snails and periwinkles, which are another type of snails. There was probably a half a dozen at least highly visible snails in the tidal zones. Some of the rocks would have 500,000 snails on them, for instance. Or like all the rocks would, right? Some places, every rock would be covered in snails. And there was all kinds of clams. There was the razorback clams, the little necks, the manillas. There was also the gooey ducks, which is a one-sided like clam. Well, not like clam, but it is a clam. Discovered by the Canadian military when they were recovering munitions dumped after the Vietnam War. They discovered this deep water clam. And so then there's the oysters, there's the scallops, there's many different species of oysters and scallops and abalones. And then typically all the rocks were also covered in mussels. And so there's some unbelievable diversity. It was really magic, right? There was also around 480 species of worms in the tidal zones. There was around 80 species of starfish. Each species came in multiple vibrant colors. 700 algae. And then there were none. And we spent tortures, is the only way to describe it. Absolute tortures. It was torture, the experience. To go up, just to make everything work, just to keep everything moving forward. And I was under siege the entire time. And I'm not bragging, I'm stating a fact. This is what we've done, and the species are gone. This is an extinction event. It really did happen, even though now they're denying it. This is another model based on 26 days of radioactive fallout covers the entire planet, right? So I know I digressed a bit tonight. But every once in a while I feel that I have to remind everybody why we're here and what we're fighting for. and what the reality of it is, and why it's important that we can't change what happened, but we can hold the nuclear industry accountable. For instance, we can stop it from destroying the future of humanity. Maybe I don't know if we can or not. So what happened was, you had so much radioactive fall that you saturated the thyroid glands of all the species and all the animals, all the mammals. But you also saturated the skeletons of all these species. And so you had permanently saturated thyroids glands, which meant you're producing radioactive hormones for the rest of their lives. And you saturated their skeletons, which meant you're producing radioactive stem cells. And so the only species we found were always mutated, especially when it came to the starfish and that. And because I went up and done this, and when I came ashore, I'd done what I'm doing right now. I got out and told a story. I've done everything that a person can do to educate the population, right? Now, they've done everything they can to make the population complacent. So the reactor 4, this is just a fraction of the media claiming that they're in reactor 4. When you look at the building to your left, that's actually reactor 4. And the place where they're claiming to be, this is just a fraction of the media that done it, is about 140 feet above the stump that remains. So they wiped out all of these species and successfully covered it up. It was impossible to go from the low tide to the high tide line in British Columbia. And that's why it was so famous, right? Beautiful British Columbia. A tropical rainforest, 27,000 islands. And all of these species were there too. They're there because they're genetically superior selected. And they don't have ice that comes in there in the wintertime, like on the East Coast, where they have all this pack ice, could be 200 miles wide, and the wind blows it all on the coastline and scrubs the coastline, right? But British Columbia doesn't have a particular attribute. So all the species that are in the tidal zones are the genetic superior selection through millions of generations, right? And so when you took that gene pool out of the equation, you set us on a course for big problems. So the migratory birds would normally come along, and they would supplement their diet right here in the tidal zones, which is around 19-foot tide exchange. So it's very accessible to all the animals in the forest, and it was a smorgasbord of life. That's what was so amazing about that. It's surreal when you go there. I took it for granted, and now that it's gone, of course, I don't take it for granted. But I have so many fond memories. It's just absurd. The absurdness of so much. And so whenever I was going to get seafood, I would never use my dive gear. I would just use free dive and go down and pick whatever I could free diving. Never more than you were going to eat, obviously, right? But it's heartbreaking for me, see? Because this was like, these were literally my friends. That's how I seen these species, because I was there every day, up to 100 days at a time. And I seen them different than the average person does, because I lived amongst it every day, all night. I lived out there. I didn't go ashore every day. I was out there all day, all night. So you wake up in the morning to this aroma of life, right, in the air. And this incredible diversity it wasn't unusual to wake up and there'd be a wolf at the tide line looking out at you, for instance. Or a bunch of little tiny reindeer that were probably this big and this high with a full set of antlers. And they had no fear of you because there's 27,000 islands, and The wolves would be on the mainland mostly. And so once you got into the outlying islands, there was no natural predators for these little tropical reindeers in the tropical forest. But this is, underneath that is mussels, see that? And then you see these, like, this is a leatherback starfish. And so you would wait till high tide before you went in and put up your beach lines, because you couldn't walk up through all this without slipping and hurting yourself. And so what we would do, we would anchor off. And underwater, this is normal for me. This is what it always looks like. And I used to pick 20,000 of them every day when I worked at the sea urchins, for instance, only the 3-inch. And what happened was they got inundated with these artificial plumes. That was your Neptunian plume. This is a plutonium plume. And then the French IRSN, French government, nuclear radiation under Ministry of Defense Environmental Industry Research models, is based on 1 million to 10 million atoms. You have the French or the German Research Institute put out this model based on 6 years of dispersal just into the ocean, but the whole planet was covered in just 20 days to 30 days, right? Because they never stopped growing food in Japan. In the first year, by 2012, they had an extra 865,000 extra cancers. 865,000 extra cancers. Just in the first year. But there's more than that worldwide because they're shipping. It's just Fukushima Prefecture produces over 1 billion pounds a year of rice alone, not counting the other stuff, right? And we know your food sucks up radiation. So then the next question, of course, is why is every nuclear power plant, except for a few, surrounded by farms? How come? Are they purposely trying to poison you? Irreversible heart damage for children with 50 atoms a kilogram of cesium-137. And before Fukushima, 100 atoms a kilogram is nuclear waste, but after it was considered safe to eat. But it's not safe to eat because we know 50 atoms a kilogram will cause irreversible heart damage for children, and that 50 atoms a kilogram will cause permanent lesions in adults in their organs. Inhaling just one hot particle can cause a cancer. But when you look at all the nuclear power plants and you start seeing this pattern that they're almost all surrounded by farms, that is the most frightening thing I ever seen. And the further I went down the rabbit hole, the more I was just incredibly, horrifically, just horrifyingly shocked. And then when you look at all the studies, foliage and root uptake of cesiums, of strontiums, of zirconium in tomato plants. So then, but why would you have farms around nuclear power plants when you have all of these studies saying that's the worst thing you could do? Because all nuclear power plants are hemorrhaging radiation from the fuel pools. Now, this headline is great. Child risk of cancer from radiation 10 to 100 times higher than an adult with the same exposure. It's actually it's over 1,000 times worse because the children are still developing, right? And so they're dependent upon their stem cells and they're dependent upon their hormones, and now they got radioactive hormones and radioactive stem cells. And that's applicable to all the species, not just humans. And so what you expect to see is an explosion of problems, health problems. So why are the nuclear power plants surrounded by farms when the nuclear power plant fuel pools have no containment and are splitting atoms into the environment? And so it's not just cancers, it's heart problems, liver problems, lung problems, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid. Radiation levels on the US West Coast spiked to over 1 million times normal after Fukushima. 1 million times normal. That was cesium-137, which pulses energy 600 feet every second. And children with 11 atoms start to see heart problems. So you have a million and 10 million atoms per cubic meter of air covering the entire planet, but 11 atoms will cause heart problems for children. Imagine what it's going to do for birds and insects, mammals and animals, and the biota and everything else. Why is every nuclear power plant, except for a few surrounded by farms, when they know how nasty the radiation is once it's intook or uptaked into your bodies? Influence developing of temperate fruit tree species on the potential for the uptake of radionuclides. Why is every nuclear power plant surrounded by farms? 50 becquerels a kilogram in humans lead to irreversible lesions in the vital organs. So why is every nuclear power plant surrounded by farms when they have so much evidence, not suggesting, but defining that this is the worst idea conceivable? And they have endless studies knowing this is the worst thing you can do. And then what are you left with, see? Nuclear radiation, the most carcinogenic thing that exists. Mascot asks Fukushima kids to gargle to stay safe from radiation, and that the radioactive sparkles are for happy children. Of course, radiation is brutal on children because they're going to end up with the radioactive hormones and radioactive stem cells, and their health issues are going to be very varied and wide. And you know, when you put them on these freshwater rivers, they're feeding all the farms too, but also they're you go 100 miles downstream, there could be 2 million people are drinking that water. So officially, the buildings don't look like this. Officially, they got all the fuel out of the fuel pools at the top of this building. Of course, they didn't. Reactor 4. And officially, they got all the fuel out of the fuel pool of Reactor 3. And of course, they didn't. So once you start telling lies like that, how do you come out and say, oh, we actually made that up? You don't, see? And the only way that this can work is if, like United Nations, for instance, goes along with it. All the universities have to go along with it. All your media's got to go along with that story, that never happened for that story to work. And then it's clearly coordinated by United Nations. And part of their criteria is if you're going to build a nuclear power plant, is there enough farmland in your country and water? So you got all these studies saying don't put your nuclear power plants in active farm or farmland. Period. Don't do it. Grapeseed oil, you know, grapeseed oil. And this stuff is not harmless, okay? Cesium-137 immediately damages the heart muscles. It's not slow acting. It immediately damages the heart muscles. It also causes lung problems, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline. It's absolutely unequivocally the catalyst behind the explosion in Alzheimer's and dementia and autism and diabetes and Down syndrome, schizophrenia, road rage, air rage. It's 100% behind that. When I started gathering up all these pictures, because I was on a mission now, I was like, well, they can't all be surrounded by farms. And by the time you got to like 20 or 30, you're like, my goodness, they're all surrounded by farms. I couldn't believe it. Because that meant it was on purpose. Very, very disappointing. That there was an industry out there that was targeting us in our supermarkets with something that was 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. But the industry is aware of that. See, they know who I am. And all they know is they just got to get rid of me. That's all they got to do. And their troubles are going to go away. Because there is nobody else going to show up. There really isn't. So all they got to do is ostracize me from bloggers and from organizations that is easy to do, right? It's just a little switch and they type in, don't give Dana more than 100 views in 12 hours. So they type in 100 views and no more than 200 views in 24 hours or whatever, right? And his max number will be 400 views. So if 5 blogs, big blogs, put me up there and there's 1 million people watch my video, it's going to show 400 views and 35 thumbs up. And that's how simple it is to censor somebody. It's literally exactly like that. It's just a program. You just type in the parameters and say, bye-bye, Dana. And then they sit back, rake in. They get all their friends and families telling their loved ones how special. Oh, he's so special. He works in the nuclear industry. He's a nuclear scientist. The kids just love him. But they're the most evil people conceivable. Because they know what I'm telling you is true. And much worse. Don't be fooled by paid industry consultants. Low doses of ionizing radiation does cause cancer, and heart, and liver, and lung, and respiratory, and pituitary, and thyroid, and adrenaline, and Alzheimer's, and dementia, and autism, and diabetes, and Down syndrome. So 134 cesium in potatoes. So they know having all these fuel pools full of reactor cores that are splitting atoms is not a very good idea, right? An estimation of the half-life period of 137 cesium content in the root and habitat soil layer of the meadow ecosystem. Well, first off, it's so tiny it's assimilated into the plant, and then it's there pulsing energy almost at the speed of light every second. And so when you get the food, you're not getting real proper food. You're getting food that has a lot of mutations into it too. Not only does it have radiation, and a lot of your drugs are plant-based, right? So you find a lot of pharmaceutical companies are growing their crops by nuclear power plants. So your pharmaceuticals are radioactive. 16,000 workers have quit. Severe working condition. And so it's not 16,000 nuclear scientists because they don't go there. So after 13 years, should nuclear scientists work at Fukushima Meltdowns so the homeless can have a day off? You got to admit, that's a great poll. They don't like those polls in particular. Because the 16,000 workers that quit were the homeless and the destitute and the victims of society and the immigrants that don't speak the language. Not nuclear scientists or nuclear companies. They're not Jacobs. They're not Bechtel. Health physicists in the United States worried about inhaling hot particles from Fukushima, plutonium, uranium. And we have so many studies of it. We have so much documentation on it. Living in denial is not a very good solution, and it's not a very long-lasting solution. You're going to have to deal with it. At some point, we're going to deal with this. At some point, we're going to face up to it. At some point, we're going to admit it. At some point, this world is going to be left with no choice. See? So why not start now? I know I'm ahead of my time, I suppose, but we needed to start 13 years ago, 80 years ago. Thyroid cancer risks last the entire life after radiation exposure. But the exposures we're talking about are catastrophic. And if you're eating from the same supermarkets for many years, that's what they're doing with these things here. They're sending the food to the same supermarkets over and over and over. And then they're buying shares in the pharmaceutical companies that are supplying those areas. And New York Times, radiation in small doses could actually be disproportionately worse, and that the doses spread over time might be more dangerous than doses given all at once. And I second that motion. Again, like every time I see these farms, it's so heartbreaking, because you're talking about millions of people being poisoned, right? And look what they've done. The Wall Street Journal actually even mention it. Officials sharply raised the radiation levels for the victims to get iodine pills, which, by the way, is not going to help you, after the meltdown, 75 times higher than the World Health Organization recommends for children. So, imagine this stuff is 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. And so when you raise it 75 times higher than the crazies already had it at, which is United Nations, World Health Organization, which is UN, right? Which they're simply crazies. They don't have any sovereignty over any country, and everybody is going to them for numbers. It's insane. Irreversible heart damage for children at 50 atoms a kilogram. So it's impossible not to get those types of accumulations in children now post-Fukushima. They're nuclear industry, right? The nuclear industry is still going strong. There's still 1,000 fuel pools worldwide hemorrhaging radiation into the ecosystem. You see those two small stacks? That they're for venting the radiation off-site from the fuel pools. So also another problem at this site, this is another reason why nuclear scientists should be at the site, but they're not, is because the steam coming out of the ground is lethal doses. And in 2011, it was 4.7 sieverts per hour, which is 20% more than June. These are doses. You can't go there. Nobody can go there. The homeless can't go there. Imagine, if you will, a world run by psychopaths, and you have the nuclear industry and a bunch of psychopaths, right? That's exactly what's going on. There's Fukushima Reactor 4 and there's Chernobyl. Both of them were destroyed, but clearly Fukushima got the jump, right? And who they got to work in there but the homeless and the destitute and the victims of society. And they're given second-hand paper suits. And TEPCO said they burn 7,000 paper suits every day. 7,000 paper suits every day. And so a paper suit ain't going to protect you. Another interesting facet to the story. The food was banned by 55 countries and 14 prefectures for a decade, right? But not Canada. Canada removed all restrictions on June 14, 2011, a little over 90 days later. And so Japan had billions and billions of pounds of food they couldn't get rid of because it's nuclear waste, really. And so they shipped it to Canada. And now everybody in Canada has health issues. Right, there's 55 countries banned the food and 14 prefectures. 55 countries. U.S. government, the radioactive material from the reactors is 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. It's greater than from any work of man other than the atomic bomb. It's like explosions going off in the cells and blows holes in your DNA. Dr. Bill McBride, UCLA School of Medicine, Vice Chair for Research in Radiation, and the principal investigator of University of You initiate a cascade of biological responses which go on for long periods of time, even years. You get long-term immune dysfunction. Your immune system is compromised, so you're more susceptible to pathogens and viruses that were normally harmless and innocuous and benign, and eventually kill. You get long-term immune dysfunction. If you inject the flu virus in mice, it will eventually kill the irradiated animals. In normal animals, that isn't the case. So what they done was they injected they had radiation contaminated mice, and when they put because their immune system was compromised, when they put the flu virus in there, the mice would die. But in a normal mouse, that wouldn't happen, right? So the immune system is compromised for long periods of time after the radiation exposure. And the concept is that we're generating damage, which is cascading forward to. So again, right, this is an underlying a lot of the effects in the radiation exposure. And so continue to grow the food in nuclear wasteland and shipping it worldwide is the very best way of destroying humanity besides the actual emissions into the environment. And this model is a very flawed model. It's based on venting from reactor, not based on the actual nuclear meltdowns or the lost inventories. Right? And so the International Atomic Energy Agency has put a lot of effort into lulling everybody into complacency. And so most children, of course, they're incapable of rationalizing it because Spider-Man and the Hulk and all the superheroes didn't tell them it was bad, right? All the media is out there for 80 years cutting your throat. Fukushima's like eating a banana, which of course is not. Walking in the sunshine, of course is not. Flying on an airplane, of course is not. And they revel in it. They excel in telling the lies. And this is why we're in the trouble we're in, right? So how many nuclear scientists volunteered when TEPCO said, send us people who don't mind dying? This is why we have a poll. After 13 years, should nuclear scientists work at Fukushima meltdowns so the homeless can have a day off? I think it's a great idea. Why not, right? The homeless should have a day off. Official 311 notebook concerned half of Japan to be covered in nuclear waste, and 60 and older should be prepared to die. So, have you ever heard a connotation like that for a coal plant or gas plant or oil plant or anything like that? 60 and older should be prepared to die. So, what would you want a nuclear power plant in your city? And if it breaks down, this is what they're going to be talking about? Well, he lived for 60 years. Yeah, he worked hard his whole life. He should be allowed to retire. Well, no, the nuclear power plant broke down. Well, it's going to take a couple million people. That's okay. Well, how come you're not going there? Well, somebody got to organize it. 60 and older should be prepared to die. I can't even wrap my mind around that. Fire is out of control at Reactor 4. So what they decided to do was pretend Reactor 4 didn't have a fire, see? A report, Tokyo Vice Governor suggests the Fukushima draft. All of Japan must face it, and that the sale of foreign Geiger counters is banned. All of Japan must face it. 60 and older should be prepared to die. Send us people who don't mind dying. It's like a banana and a potato chip, and walking in the sunshine, getting on an airplane. And where does that leave us? How do we pick up the pieces? Like, they're claiming they're on top of Reactor 4, but Reactor 4 doesn't even exist. How do we look the other way? And this is the official story of Reactor 3 fuel pool, which it doesn't even exist. The building, it looks like this. The building done that. The fuel pools are at the top of the buildings. I just thought, like I was gonna do a die-off video tonight, but I'm still not I don't know if I'll ever be to 100%. I am feeling much better though since I started during like this cycle this week, so that's pretty cool. But they don't have a right to poison us. They don't have a right to kill all the species. They don't have a right to destroy the future. They don't have a right to destroy the health of everybody. And the minute the world has a conversation is the minute that we start holding these people. These are serial killers. These are criminals. And, you know, can you imagine if the world woke up to this going on? There'd be a lot more verbs and nouns to describe them, wouldn't it? 1,000 years from now, contaminated water from Fukushima may still be entering the Pacific Ocean. It was not maybe, you know, it will be. Right, and by the way, New York Times, radioactive material like cesium are brought back to the surface soil each year by plant growth and pollinations. So if cesium, which is their typical cover, it's a real deal. It's a very nasty isotope. But not to acknowledge the biggest byproduct of the radiated fuel rod is curium isotopes, which needs lead shielding 20 times thicker than plutonium, which is named after the devil, is a flaw. That's a flaw. And that's the subtle brainwashing by using the word cesium over and over and over. And anybody that do know about a little bit about radiation, they're going to, like, you'll see them look up to the left side of their head and then they'll say, cesium, right? And you're like, yeah, it's a waste of time to talk to them, unfortunately. Radiation levels of several dozens of sieverts possible near a number 2 reactor. So 3 sieverts is a lethal dose. Several dozen is it's pretty rough. International Atomic Energy Agency today admitted there is no such thing. There's no such thing as a safe level of radiation, that the standards are based on natural stuff, not man-made stuff. So they're basing it on bananas and potato chips and walking in the sunshine and flying on an airplane and climbing mountains. So they're not basing it on radiation. And so their standards it's equivalent. Let me see. It's equivalent to you being a lifeguard and you see a body in the bottom of the pool, but it's been there for about 10 minutes. And you say, well, the International Atomic Energy Agency says we don't have to worry about it until they're down there for 37 hours. And you're going to be like, you're crazy. They're probably drowned already. You need to go down and get them. But the International Atomic Energy Agency said they'll be okay for at least 37 hours. And we shouldn't risk ourselves until then. So just go over there and sit down, wait patiently. And if they're still there in 37 hours, we'll go down and bring them back and give them CPR. Because that's what they're doing to your planet. They're going to let you drown and make sure there's no life. And then if somebody complains, they'll try to give you CPR. And that the standards are based on natural stuff, not man-made stuff. That's what they mean by that. When it says based on benefit, there is no benefit to anthropogenic man-made radiation. And safety is when you're talking about man-made radiation. If you ate that fish at 740,000 atoms a kilogram, you're guaranteed to die eventually from that being in your body. Your health is going to go straight down over the next couple of days. You're not going to have any energy because you're not producing oxygen anymore, like enough to keep you active. your thyroids and your skeleton are producing. Your thyroids are producing radioactive hormones for the rest of your life. Your skeleton is producing radioactive stem cells for the rest of your life. It's absurd. The whole story is absurd. Officially now they say everything I showed you tonight is not true, according to the IAEA and TEPCO in Japan. And every nuclear university out there will vehemently deny everything I showed you tonight is true. And you don't got to worry about it. You don't got any competition. There's just this little group of us, and we're really good at being honest. But it's very taxing on your body to do the things I'm doing. For instance, I'm not complaining. I'm very grateful I get to do what I do. But it is very stressful, right? Every organism in the Fukushima prefecture is contaminated with radiation. 1.4 million atoms a kilogram in the worm's excrement, feces, 60 kilometers. Now, so would you eat food from an area like that? Kyoto News used the term hot zones to describe Miyagi, Iwate, and Tochigi prefectures, not just Fukushima. It's not okay. And Japan Times saying it's okay for babies to drink the radioactive milk because adults have potassium-40. And you can't conflate them. Right? So, I'll bring up something for you. Let me explain it to you, because it's not that hard, but it is if you're not familiar, right? I had to put my fingers on my glasses. I always do that when I get tired, eh? I'll clean the glasses, then I'll stick my fingers on them. I'll be like, Dana. So potassium-40 doesn't come from a reactor. Let me see if I can do a better job for you. If you want to understand how it damages your children or small animals and stuff like that, watch Chernobyl Hurts. It's about a foundation from the United Kingdom that helps the children, some of the children, quite a lot, around 6,000 children had open heart surgery because of them. So, okay, so a becquerel, which I always refer to it as an atom. And so the atom pulses energy, that's the becquerel. And it's pulsing the energy almost at the speed of light. It's an explosion, and it explodes in every direction. So it destroys your DNA and your chromosomes, your cells, and everything else in every direction every second. Your body has to repair all of that every second. And it's going to try to do that with white blood cells. And it's also going to have to attack the source of the explosion because it's not natural. It's not stardust from the universe or the solar system. It's man-made, right? And so your body doesn't recognize it, doesn't have an autoimmune trigger to defend against it. And so it will attack it with white blood cells relentlessly for the rest of your life. And so for every white blood cell, you're displacing a red blood cell. The red blood cell carries oxygen, nutrition. And so when you got every explosion, you got all these cells and chromosomes and DNA being destroyed, your body has to try to repair it. And so it has to flood your body eventually, the more you get in you. Okay, I digress. So let's go back to Japan Times. It's okay for babies to drink the radioactive milk because an adult has natural potassium-40 in the body. So potassium-40 is equal, now a curry is 37 billion atoms pulsing every second. That's considered an anthropogenic man-made. That's what it does. It pulses energy every second. So 37 billion pulses a second, whereas potassium has 71 10 millionths of a curie per gram. And so cesium-137 is 88 curies. So it's 88 times 37 billion atoms. per gram, whereas, which is 5 trillion or something pulses, right? Whereas potassium has 0.0000071 curies per gram. But these are not powerful enough to hurt your DNA or your chromosomes. Quite the opposite. Your body has to have potassium, right? And it has around 7,500 atoms of potassium in your body. So the problem is, as you're eating it, as it goes up the food chain, it bioaccumulates. And so when you're eating, if you're eating zooplankton, you might have 10,000. It's like anything else, right, where it bioaccumulates. So 1,400 becquerels for an adult, 70 kilograms. It's 20 kilograms, 20 becquerels a kilogram. Just body weight they're talking about, right? So the more you eat, the more you bioaccumulate, and as you get a couple of months or years down the road, you have an enormous amount in your body pulsing energy every second. Let's keep going here. So, half the people in Japan were close to being evacuated. And so what they mean by that is, rather than tell the truth and evacuate them, they told a lie and kept them there. And I explained that quite a lot already, but let me explain it one more time. And so reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4 all detonated, all lost all of their inventories, reactor cores, and lost their fuel pools, which is decades of reactor cores. But, you know, I always show this picture of reactor 3 and reactor 4 because just reactor 4, just reactor 3, say, just that reactor core itself was worse than all nuclear meltdowns in history combined. But there was 4 of these reactor cores that detonated. Reactor 4 had half a reactor core because you never empty the reactor cores when they're changing the fuel. And that's what they were doing. And so then the fuel pools at the top of the buildings have decades of reactor cores. So when you're looking at that, it's hard to appreciate how big it is, right? So you can see a person right here. They're building a frame for reactor 1, and where they're going to put a frame around reactor 1 to hide it from prying eyes, because it detonated. The fuel pool is gone. And this is 4 of those. So this piece, top piece right here, is that piece up right there, which is 150 feet by 150 feet, and then the height is 190 feet. So basically each one is about 50 feet up. Each one of those cross members, the beams, is around 50 feet up. And that, you can put both of these reactors on top of each other, and they would be within that span right there. So reactor 3 and 4 are clearly gone, right? Melted fuel from Fukushima reactor 3 is the highly lethal plutonium mixed oxide fuel. Reactor 3 was fueled with plutonium. U.S. government's worst case scenario, likely reality, the entire nuclear core was injected into the environment. And so that's reactor 3 over there, right? It's pretty easy to appreciate the reactor core and the fuel pools. Not just the reactor cores, which nobody wants to acknowledge the fuel pools are gone. Lots of people died, right? There's over 300 police officers died in a no-go zone guarding the area to keep people out. And reactor 3 may have the second meltdown a week after the first. The helicopters couldn't go near it. They tried one drop or something like that. But all the helicopter pilots at Chernobyl died, over 600 of them. High radiation forces withdrawal workers trying to restore power. March the 18th. Now, by March the 18th, the buildings had already detonated. And when you see the pictures, remember you're talking about around 8 reactor cores were at the roof, and so that's thrown all over the site. So there was nothing they could do. They couldn't restore power, first off, because the buildings are destroyed. And, right, the buildings are completely destroyed. There's no way to restore power. There's lethal doses everywhere you can imagine. This is several weeks down the road, this picture. And do you see all kinds of workers and employees and everybody else? Of course you don't, right? Because it's... But when you see a headline, say the average person, Fukushima workers... let me go backward for a second. High radiation forces withdrawal workers. That was March the 18th. This was March the 16th. So the media was able to cover a story immediately. Japan's Prince's son said no one died, no one got injured from Fukushima, no one. No one is worried about the radiation. And then everybody was worried about the radiation. Japan Times column. As the public, possibly worldwide, sickens over time, the truth will come out about Fukushima. As the public, possibly worldwide, sickens over time from the plutonium mixed oxide reactor in particular, and not just reactor 4, but there's at the top of the buildings were around 8 reactor cores. That's where they kept the fuel pools because they don't have a repository anywhere on the planet, right? So they're kept in the fuel pools where they're splitting atoms. Scientists reveal details of unprecedented mass mortality on the West Coast that began the summer of 2011. And I was on the ocean June the 4th, 2015 on my research expeditions, which I showed you earlier, right? Unprecedented cataclysmic die-off of birds on the entire West Coast, and that the beaches are covered with dead bodies. Never seen anything like it. Ignored at our peril. The canary in the coal mine for us. And of course, I was out there reporting on this. I was demonized. I still am. I'm under siege even where I am right now. Everybody hates me. The industry is really good at demonizing you. And so it's a very heartbreaking job on top of that, what I do. But it's definitely my calling, thank goodness. And I'm not to be driven away. It's possible to get me to give it up. And I've been injured many, many times over the years. And the only thing that's important to me is getting back in and telling the story. Keeping the truth alive, and hopefully getting better at telling the story. This was Dr. Jerry Thomas from the Imperial College of London, and in particular, she's a notorious nuclear crank, but she's a very dangerous one. She uses radiation on children in the hospitals in the United Kingdom, and there's never a good outcome. It's a horrific person. Well, they're not really people, are they? And I think I'm about ran out of steam here. That's okay. Well, animals starving as the food chain continues to collapse. Mass starvation event plagues the West Coast. Everything is emaciated. Because when you cover a whole planet with radiation, that's what happens, right? And we know, we went out and done the research year after year after year, and the species to your left are exterminated. It's an extinction event. It's an extinction event because it actually did happen. It really did happen. There really is adverse side effects that are catastrophic. And the they know you're probably going to wake up. So they're engineering wars, famines, diseases, anything and everything to keep you off balance, keep you divided. And so my idea was always to be a lighthouse for those who was looking for the documentation. And I always believed that the more people that see this information, because there's so many smart people out there, right, is the only way we can have a future, because we ain't got no future pretending it didn't happen. It's the opposite. And after going out there year after year after year and seeing the extinction event with my own eyes, no smells, no birds, no insects. There's 30,000. There used to be 30,000 insects at the high tide line. When tide went out, they would come down and do what the insects were generally meant to do in that environment, right? Pick out the dead. And that whole ecosystem was just... And we take it for granted, don't we? We always take it for granted. It's so easy to take it for granted because it's just unimaginable. And one Fukushima is enough to destroy humanity and the 8 million species. So nuclear doesn't have a right to exist. If you made it this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Let's come back over to the poll and close up the poll. Call it a night. It's been a tough week. We got through it. It's been a tough night. We got through it. After 13 years, should nuclear scientists work at the Fukushima meltdown so the homeless can have a day off? I think they should. I think it's a pretty good idea. Have a great night, everybody. Hugs for everybody. We'll see everybody on Sunday show. We're in a heat wave down here. Basically, not dead to the game. We can't do much. We don't have to do much. So we're going to keep trying to do at least this much. We'll see everybody on the other side Sunday night unless there's something dramatic happens. Have a great night. Have a great day. Hugs for everybody. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you make this far. Bottom of the description, there's 2 ways to donate to me through PayPal and my website. And it's been a few weeks. I don't know how we're going to keep doing it. People need to find a way and just donate enough for a cup of coffee or whatever, and that'll add up, right? Take care, folks. Have a great night. Hugs for everybody. Take care, folks.